Thought we would start this morning by talking about a little bit of church etiquette for a minute. It's actually going to set up where we're going with this message, so bear with me for a minute. For instance, how would you greet one another in church? How are we supposed to do that? A lot of people may know this name, Emily Post. Question, how many of you have heard the name Emily Post? Okay. So she kind of wrote the Bible, if you will, on etiquette. And she wrote this originally in 1922. For example, if you didn't already know this, Emily Post wrote, "A gentleman should never initiate shaking hands with a lady. But should he do that," Emily Post wrote, "no thoroughbred lady would refuse to shake any hand that is honorable, not even the hand of a coal heaver, at the risk of her fresh white gloves." So if you are a coal heaver today, you have picked the right weekend to join us. I hope that you feel extremely welcome this morning. She had some other rules on greeting in church. She said, people do not greet each other in church except at a wedding. Hello should not be said on this occasion in church because it is too familiar. I think we can pretty much throw that one out. And so we need to come up with, how do we handle etiquette in church today? For example, here are a couple things that Emily Post did not write about back in 1922. If a guest comes up and asks a long-time attendee of the church where something is, should we A, say, down there, turn left, up the stairs, go left? Or should we say, just a minute, I'll come with you? Some of you are probably laughing because probably you have done that before. What do we do about the dress code here at Trinity Church? Well, people ask me, and it even says this on our website in case you're wondering. It says wear clothes. Just put clothes on. That's all I ask. And hopefully the clothes cover everything too. Maybe I should put a limit, or a minimum. You at least have a minimum of these things. And what about drinks? Oh, this is a good one. I'm sure this will make some people twist in their seat a little bit. What about bringing drinks into the sanctuary? What about wearing hats in the sanctuary? I grew up Catholic. I don't know how many times I got smacked in the back of the head by the priest because I was wearing my hat into the church. That's a big no-no. But here's our policy. Our mission trumps policy. So even if we had a policy that said no drinks in the sanctuary, which we don't, if we had that policy and somebody walked in our church for the very first time and they had a Coke in their hand, guess what we're not going to do? We're not going to do the thing that most churches do, and that is say, please leave the can outside the sanctuary. Because guess what that guest will never do again? Step foot into your sanctuary. Somebody breaking the policy is not worth losing the opportunity to share the love of Christ with that person. The reason we bring this up today is because one day Jesus decided to introduce a whole new etiquette in his day into worship. And it was a teaching that really kind of worked itself into the 12 steps, and it's the steps that we're going to look at today. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 23 through 24, Jesus is speaking through the Sermon on the Mount. He says, let's say that we've come to worship and that you have a gift to bring to him. And this is a special moment. You're coming to the altar. You're approaching the altar. It's super important. But while you're doing that, you happen to remember a relationship that is kind of broken in your life right now. And you come to think about that relationship and you realize that something is not healthy in that relationship. You've said or you've done something to another person and it's not resolved. So what should you do? This was actually something that was highly debated among the rabbis of that day. And they actually had come to say that the rabbis of that time said that only if you're not doing something more important. If something is more important, then that can just wait if that relationship is not being attended to. It can wait. And of course, they viewed worship of God as the highest priority in any situation. And so imagine being one of the rabbis sitting around hearing Jesus as he says that when you approach the altar, when you're in worship, to leave your gift at the altar and leave. Interrupt your worship and go give the attention you need to that relationship. And when things are resolved, then come back to the altar, get your gift, and present it to God. Totally contrary to what the rabbis of that time would have expected. You see, what Jesus was literally saying was, your relationships with each other are more important in times in your life than worshiping me. He placed a high priority on relationships. It made me wonder when I thought about this passage when Jesus was teaching this. Because Jesus was, he was dead serious about what he was saying. I wonder if people got up as he was talking and actually left and tended to the relationships that were broken. I wonder if they actually thought about the times that they had cheated someone and not healed that relationship. That they had left something unapologized for, the anger that they had towards a person. I bet that happened a little bit. I bet people wanted to, but there was something inside of them that feared, what will other people think if I get up and I leave when Jesus is talking? I mean, come on, he's the Messiah, right? By the way, right now, during this sermon, and I'm really serious about this because we're not just doing this, we're doing what Jesus says. That's what we're about here. And if you feel that pain, or that pang in the side of feeling like God is bringing a memory to mind, if you get a little convicted and you think, I've done something or I need to say something, I've wronged somebody, then you do what Jesus said. You get up and leave the room and go obey Jesus' command and walk out of the sermon. That's perfectly okay. Because in fact, if that happens, and our hearts and our minds are right, and everyone around you is going to cheer you on because we're a Me Too church. Because we all have relationships like that. Whether we want to admit it or not, we all have relationships that we need to give more attention to. So far, we've looked at steps that we've admitted our lives are unmanageable. My ego and my sin are out of control. Then we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Then we let go and we surrendered our lives and our wills to the care of God. And we're working week by week, and we create this fearless and searching moral inventory. But we didn't stop there. We went on, as we talked last week, to confess to God and to ourselves and to another human being the nature of our wrongs. And I just want to say that if you've done these steps, if you've been putting effort into these steps, good job. I'm proud of you for putting forth an effort into your relationship with God, but also taking seriously the relationships that you have with the people around you. Because literally, this is not just a step that is about getting you better. This is a step about making us stronger human beings and putting us in a place where we can be one with God. So this week, we look at steps 8 and 9. It says that we've made a list of all the persons we have harmed. and become willing to make amends to them, and we made amends wherever it was possible. And speaking personally, this is a tough one for me because I don't like conflict. And this says, walk into it. And that goes against every fiber of my being. But you know, one of the beautiful things about working these steps and actually doing them is I realized that it's not my fear of conflict that's the actual problem. I have some underlying issues that have led to me being afraid of conflict. And I won't get into them because we don't have time for my counseling session. So today we look at a story in the Bible found in Luke chapter 19. It's the story of Zacchaeus, and this is a perfect story of making amends. So let's look at this story together. Luke chapter 19. It says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be a guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man, too, is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Tax collectors, if you don't know, were not very much liked. They had there was a hate-hate relationship. There was no love involved with tax collectors. Mark Twain said this about it. He was asked one time, what's the difference between a taxidermist and a tax collector? His response was, the taxidermist only takes your skin. In ancient Israel, tax collectors were particularly despised. The way you got a franchise as a tax collector was you went to the government and you bid to the government how much that you would bring to the government in taxes from the people. And once you set that bid, you could then go back and charge more to the people. And whatever above and beyond that you had to pay to the government, you got to put into your own pockets. And so tax collectors literally were some of the most corrupt people of the time. One village, skipping that. The problem with the tax collectors wasn't that they weren't doing this for the government of Israel. They were doing this for the government of Rome. And Rome was literally oppressing the people. And so they were considered going against God. They were working for the enemy. Fellow Israelites did not like these tax collectors. Rabbis actually said that the only time it's okay to lie is when you're lying to a tax collector. And just in case you're wondering, that's not in the Bible, so don't try that at home. The etiquette was very clear in that time. This is why in the New Testament, you constantly see 2 different categories being associated with each other. Jesus, when he was talking to his disciples and the Pharisees, he says, when the Pharisees were talking to Jesus' disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Or in Luke chapter 15, it says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered to hear Jesus. They lumped the tax collectors and the sinners together because they were considered the worst of the worst that you could find. Zacchaeus was not just a tax collector. He was the chief tax collector. That meant he had little minions running around doing all of his work for him, and all he did was line his pockets with what he took from the people of Israel. tax collectors were not liked. So Zacchaeus is a tax collector, and he decides that he wants to see this rabbi that everyone has been talking about. But unfortunately, Zacchaeus is a little vertically challenged. He and I have something in common. He couldn't see the people. Some people say that, oh, he was just a short guy. That's why he ran and he climbed a sycamore tree. If you've heard that in the Bible, little kid, the flannel graph, you might be familiar with all that stuff. That's not the reason he climbed the tree, just because he was short. If you're a tax collector and you're hated by everybody, are you just going to go into the crowd? No. They're probably going to try and kill you. They don't want you around. So if he was short and he couldn't see, and they weren't just going to let him in to see Jesus, he needed a way to get up to see Jesus. And so he says that he climbs a sycamore tree. But it says that he ran ahead of the crowd. And the first thing we have to see is that in Near Eastern culture, climbing a tree was not something a rich man did. It was not very dignified. So he runs, but then it says that he was a wealthy man and he climbed a tree. You don't climb a tree if you have any dignity at all in that time. Luke tells us that he climbed a sycamore tree, and he tells us that for 3 reasons. For one thing, they had really low branches. And remember, he's short. So he needed the low branches. The second reason was because it had big leaves. So he could not only be in the tree, but it would also hide him so that the people couldn't see him when the crowd passed by. And the third reason that we know that he mentions that it's a sycamore tree is because through instructions in these books called the Mishnahs, which were ancient instructions, it said that a sycamore tree had to be grown at least 50 cubits outside of the village. And so this also gives us a geographic recognition that it was historically accurate that he was outside the city and climbing a sycamore tree. Okay? So Jesus and the crowd come upon Zacchaeus. And Jesus yells out to Zacchaeus, and if you're in the crowd, you're getting ready to just applaud because you know what Jesus is going to do. He's calling Zacchaeus down, and he's getting ready to just lay into Zacchaeus because of how bad of a sinner he is and how he's cheated so many people out of their money. That's what you expect Jesus to do, but that is not what Jesus does. Jesus comes down, and he tells him to come down, and then he says, I'm going to your house. Meals were a special thing. Those were special moments. You did not eat with sinners. Because guess what that made you? A sinner. And if you were a Jewish rabbi and tax collectors were actually considered unclean, you couldn't be unclean and eat a meal. There was this whole process you had to go through to become clean so that you could even eat the food that God had provided for you. And so he literally goes and makes himself unclean and sits at a table with a tax collector, and he eats a meal with him. And the crowd couldn't believe it. They say he's gone to eat and be a guest at the house of a sinner. They were blown away by it. As Zacchaeus is sitting there at the table with Jesus, his heart really starts to churn because he looks and he realizes there's Jesus. And he's taking all the ridicule, he's taking all the shame that I deserve, and he's putting it on himself. He's sitting there, and all he cares about are the people around the table. You see, when rich people ate a meal, it was almost like a public event. People would literally come and watch, because a lot of times it was done out in a courtyard, and so people would line the property fence and watch this meal take place. And so this was literally a public event going on, and Jesus is taking the ridicule, taking the shame, and he's putting it on himself. And Zacchaeus takes notice of it. He realizes what Jesus is doing for him. But when Zacchaeus looks at Jesus, he doesn't just see Jesus. Now he sees a widow. And how she has no place to live because Zacchaeus took her farm. He sees a couple of little orphan kids and they're beggars on the street because he took their inheritance. He sees a man who used to have a little shop, who used to be a merchant in town, but Zacchaeus robbed him of it. And that man had a son who was so embittered, he rebelled against Rome, and the Romans killed his son because his dad had no business. And now he has no son because Zacchaeus took what wasn't his. Now in that moment, he sees Jesus, and now he sees Jesus. Now the way he sees things in his life are completely different because of Jesus in his life. If we look at ourselves and we see the sin in our lives without Jesus, the way we see ourselves with sin in our lives with Jesus should not be the same. You see, because when we're sinners and we don't have Jesus in our life, things look pretty hopeless. And for some, they really are hopeless. But things should not look hopeless no matter what we're facing in life if Jesus is in our life. If you feel hopeless and Jesus is in your life, I beg to say to you, you're not focusing on Jesus. You're focusing on your circumstances. And in that moment, Zacchaeus stood up and he said to Jesus, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I had cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." You understand what this means for Jericho? No more shaking down widows. No more robbing little orphans. No more squeezing the peasants of their money. Jesus had brought justice to Jericho. See, when the good news comes into the tax collector, it's not just good news for the tax collector. It's good news for everybody. But you see, what Zacchaeus was doing was he was going public with the wrongs that he had done. He didn't just keep them to himself. He didn't just confess them to God, but he confessed them to the public. And he said, so that everyone could hear in this public event of a meal, he says, I will pay back everything I've taken. And if I've cheated anybody, I'll give them 4 times the amount. What is Zacchaeus doing? Zacchaeus is making amends. Zacchaeus is making amends. Imagine if Zacchaeus had skipped that step. Imagine if he had skipped it. Because sometimes in church we think that, imagine Zacchaeus stood and said, I used to be a sinner, but Jesus has forgiven me. I'm so glad. I'm sorry for the things I'd done, but Jesus has forgiven me, so all is well. I'm sorry. Imagine if that was the case. But you see, here's the reality. Grace is not permission to not do what is right. Grace is the power to do what is right. I'll say it again. Grace is not permission to not do what is right. Grace is the power to do what is right. Because in the journey of our lives, when things get tough and we have to face the consequences of the things that we've done, we don't get to stand and say, God has forgiven me, I do not deserve this punishment. No, God's grace gives you the power to face the punishment, to face what we deserve in this life, because God has taken care of what we don't deserve in the next. So looking at steps 8 and 9, I want to give you 5 steps really quickly on how this would look. Step number 1, I actually make a list of people who I have wronged. actually sitting down and making a list. Now, could you imagine if you were Zacchaeus and you started to make your list? Your list would probably be pretty darn long. And I thought I was a pretty good guy until I sat down and started making this list, and I'm like, I hope no judge finds out my list, because it's a pretty darn long list. Granted, none of it was criminal, so don't come after me, Nick. But we all do things that harm people. And so sitting down and actually making a list of the things or the people that we have wronged. In the next column over, I then sat down and said, have I ever done or said anything that might have hurt or harmed these people? And then I get specific. What was it that I did that harmed them? And number 2, what is the harm I've caused in these people's lives? And so I'll sit down and literally write out specifically what it is that we've done, that I've done. A lot of times when we think about times where we've been deceptive, we'll say, I've been deceptive, but I haven't. We don't think about actually the harm that we've caused a person. But if we're on the other side where someone has harmed us, we think about the harm, right? This person has caused this harm because of what they did. But when we do something, rarely do we actually think about the harm that we caused them. But you see, we have to put ourselves in a situation and in a place where we are seeing the harm that we're causing to people. Let me give you a funny little story to help you understand how this works. A mom has a 7-year-old boy named Billy and a baby in the other room, and there's a scream. The mom says, "What was that?" As she runs into the room. Billy says, "The baby pulled my hair. It hurt. I'm so mad." The mom says, "Well, the baby doesn't know how much it hurts." A few seconds later, there's another scream. "What was that?" Billy says, "Now the baby knows." How many times do when we get hurt, our first reaction is to hurt them back? That's our response. We never stop and think about the harm that we're doing. But we have to stop and think about the things that we're doing to the people around us and how they harm the people around us. Number 3, am I willing to make amends? Am I willing to make amends? You have to come to that place. Don't ever go to someone to make amends if you can't do it sincerely. Because what's the point of going to someone and trying to make amends if you're lying in the midst of making amends? If you do that, just go back to your thing, your paper where you've wronged people, and just add their name to the bottom of the list again. Because instead of ending this cycle, you're just creating it and keeping it going. Make sure that you're in a place where you can honestly make amends. Number 4, in this process, talk to a wise, trusted, confidential Christian brother or sister about making amends before you go and you do this. There's a couple of reasons behind this. One is they can probably give you some insight into what not to say. I'm one of those people that just says it how it is, and Jennifer says, reword that, because that's just going to make them even more angry. So we need to make sure that we're saying the right things. When we go into a situation, we need to be honest with it. And going right along with, am I willing to make amends? There are some situations where we should not go to that person face to face because it will cause harm. The step actually says, I am willing to go make amends in situations where it will not cause further harm. So we want to take harm out of the situation, not add to it. So I can think of examples that coming to my mind that I don't want to share, but of someone that had caused harm to a family member, and as soon as they were able, the first thing they did was show up at my office. I thought I was in a place where I could forgive that person, and I thought I could see them face to face. And now all of a sudden, seeing that person face to face, I had all kinds of emotions that I didn't know what was going to happen. And I just simply looked at the person and said, "You need to leave now." Luckily, they just left. But I didn't realize that I was not ready. But even when I come to a place where I can forgive them, it's not a situation that I can do face to face, because it will cause more harm than it would good. Number 5, go to the other person when it is appropriate. Ask for forgiveness and offer to make things right. When you go to the person, here's what you do not do. Will you forgive me for what I did? But I did it only because you did. See, asking forgiveness has nothing to do with the other person. It has everything to do with where you are. I've had people ask me, well, what if I go to that person and they don't forgive me? They didn't forgive you. That's not on you. Our job is to go seek forgiveness and seek reconciliation in that relationship. We cannot control them. We cannot control the outcome of what will happen, because we're putting ourselves in a situation where we're literally humbling ourselves and saying, you know what, I don't know what the end result will be, but this is where my heart is. I want this relationship to be healthier, and this is what's standing in our way, and so I want to own up to my stuff, even if they don't own up to theirs. I don't know how many times I've heard people say, well, I'm not going to do that because they won't say I'm sorry. It doesn't matter if they're sorry or not, because it's their job to come to you and ask for your forgiveness. Don't go to them expecting them to ask for your forgiveness. You go to them expecting them to hear you and to listen to what you have to say. There are people who have asked me also, what if I've tried this before and it didn't work? Try it again. Try it again. The one thing I've realized, that relationships don't get broken overnight. And so we can't expect them to be healed overnight. It doesn't happen. So Zacchaeus gets on this path. It says, here and now I'm giving away half my stuff, and I want to make amends to anybody that I have cheated, and I'm going public with it. Jesus looks at Zacchaeus, and he didn't say, oh man, Zacchaeus, you don't need to do that. It's okay. I'm going to die on the cross, and I'm going to forgive all the sins that you have committed, and my grace covers you and loves you. You're good to go. Don't do that. He didn't say, Zacchaeus, this is going to cost you a ton of money. Are you sure you want to do this? No, he didn't say that either. He said, today, salvation has come to this house. And I want to tell you today, salvation still comes. And hopefully it's not just to a house, but it's to every individual. You see, Jesus is connecting our hearts with salvation. If we don't put ourselves in a place where we put two priorities above everything, and that's loving God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. So pretty much all of your being should put God first. And then he says, secondly, other people before yourself. Other people. You see, we think we're good at number one. And we'd like to hope that we're good at number two. But I think for the most of us, myself included, we've put number three in number one. Because when we look at the 12 steps, we say, I don't have anything I need to confess. I don't have any major problems in my life. I'm a good person. But hear this, and hear it harshly for what it is, because Jesus would say this. If you cannot bring yourself to put God first and other people in front of you, the question becomes, has salvation come? Has salvation come to you if you're putting yourself above God and others? Because I think Jesus would say you can't. And salvation comes to those who realize that they can't. I think it's suited that we celebrate communion this morning. Because Jesus is literally going to come and share a meal with us sinners. And that's what I love about celebrating communion, is because I actually get a seat at the table. Because think about if Jesus would have only allowed the people who were perfect to share the meal with him. Let's just say he would have a whole lot of food to himself. Because there was none of the disciples that deserved to sit around the table because they weren't sinners. The reality is they were all sinners. They all needed what this meal represents. They all needed Jesus to die on a cross to forgive their sins, just as much as you and I do. But the reality is Jesus sat around a table and he loved them all, knowing that they would abandon him, knowing that they were going to leave him in his darkest hour. He knew that they would leave. Jesus says this isn't a moment to leave people out. This is a moment to bring people in. You see, Jesus would not allow a simple thing as someone wearing a hat. Jesus wouldn't allow somebody bringing in a Polar Pop from that other place and, making his clean meal unclean. Jesus wouldn't care about that. Jesus wouldn't care about that kid who comes in with the holy jeans because he can't afford better jeans. God doesn't care about how bad you stink or how good you smell when you come to church. He doesn't. Because all he sees is when he sees those things is something that could be used to keep you out. And he says it's not worth it. He died on a cross to forgive us of our sins. Do you think that he wants people to put etiquette in the way of people receiving him? People hearing the gospel? No. Jesus would have literally, I think, if the Pharisees came around the table and they were all big and they said, well, these people don't deserve to be here. I can picture Jesus escorting them out and saying, this meal's not for you, evidently. Because it's for everyone. But you have to be willing to let it be for everyone. You see, I don't believe that this meal is about what denomination that you're a part of. Because I don't believe Jesus died for specific denominations. I don't believe that Jesus died for specific people. He died for all of us. And so therefore, he invites all of us to a table. And not just the people here, but the people out there that we think don't deserve this. Jesus says they deserve it just as much as you do. So when you receive the body and the blood of Christ, I pray that you would see it as a means of God's grace. It's his grace extending to you and saying, you're worth it. You're worthy of what I've done for you. Not because of you, but because of me. I make you worthy of it. So when we receive the body and blood of Christ, I pray that you would receive it with a heart that's open. Open from receiving from him all the things you think you're not. All the shortcomings that you think that you have that he cannot conquer. I pray that you would receive him in spite of all those things, because those things do not matter. What matters is Jesus and who he says you are.